Hello, friends and followers. Join me today on my third and final part of my Lenten journey. And since we are about to enter Holy Week, and since we just left Women's History Month, I'm going to celebrate by bringing you my thoughts on the book, Her Story, Her Strength, 50 God-Empowered Women of the Bible. But first a little bit of story. I came across this book one day when I was in Barnes & Noble waiting for my mom to finish up on her errands. I just so happened to be walking by the religious section, and I came across the section for children's books, religious children's books, and I came across this book. So I took a look at it and I thought, you know what? Why not? Looks interesting enough. Probably not something that'll really engross me, but it's worth trying anyway. So I opened it. And my, oh my, did I underestimate just how much this book would impact me. But I'll get more into that a little bit later. First, let's take a look at the front of the book. Now, the first thing that you'll notice, aside from the delicate and very colorful font, are the 9 different women of various shades and colors of skin. You've got women with a darker skin tone, like Pharaoh's daughter and Sarah, and then you've got ones with a more medium skin tones, such as Hagar and Eve, and the rest of the women have various shades of lighter skin. And I'm sure many different girls will appreciate that, and so many girls of color will feel very seen knowing that there are women with who either match or come close to matching their skin tone. And also it's refreshing to see a more historically accurate depiction of women in the Bible, because the children's Bibles that I grew up with had characters that were depicted as white, or at the very least had very light skin. But as we all know, since these women were from somewhere in the Middle East, they most likely had darker shades of skin, or varying shades of skin, I should say. Though, and it kind of makes sense why a lot of biblical and religious figures are depicted as white, since they were originally made in Europe, which at the time was a dominantly white country. But now that we've taken a better look at historical records and really read about where most of these women were most likely from, it makes a lot more sense to portray them with more diversity. And this can also be explained when you read the author's note. Sarah Parker Rubio edits children's and young adult books by day and writes them by night. She was born in the United States, grew up in Costa Rica and Ecuador, and now has a bilingual and bicultural family with her husband, Colombian composer Gary Rubio. They live in Cincinnati with their 3 wonderful children and 2 sassy cats. So yeah, since the author grew up in a multicultural and multiracial family, and she grew up in a multicultural and multiracial background, and grew up in 2 different countries, she was most likely exposed to people from different backgrounds and different cultures, different races, and different ethnicities. So she decided to depict what she saw in her work, because oftentimes people write and draw, they tend to depict what they see and what they're familiar with. So it's good to introduce kids to people of various nationalities and cultures and such, and she managed to do so in a way that doesn't feel forced or unnatural. But enough of that. As you can tell, I've taken quite a few notes on this book because there's a lot to say about it, but I'm not going to get into all of them, otherwise we'd be here all day. And plus, I don't want to give away too much in case any of you are interested in checking it out for yourselves, or if any of your children, if you have children, are interested in checking it out yourselves. So let's not waste any more time, and instead let's take a look inside the book as I get into the many, many, many things that I liked about it, the few teeny little nitpicks, things that I didn't like so much, and the impact that it's left on me, and presumably the impact that I believe it can leave on many kids. So, let's start with the very first page of the book, which is Eve. Now, the first thing that most likely catches your eye is the stunning illustration of a woman with long hair covered in flora and fauna and flowers of all different colors. And that's a common thing you'll notice throughout the entire book is the illustrations are chef's kiss. And the next thing you'll notice is the wording. And I'll read it to you to give you an example. The woman opened her eyes and stared into the vast, beautiful space she would soon learn to call the sky. Bright colors and wondrous sights she didn't yet have names for swirled all around her. Green leaves, blue streams, warm golden sunlight, juicy red fruit. She breathed in, enjoying the feeling of her chest expanding and the delicious smells that tickled her nose. She found she could wiggle her fingers and toes and sit up, then stand. She stretched her hands high above her head. It felt so good to move. The woman caught movement out of the corner of her eye and realized she wasn't alone. Brightly feathered creatures perched in the trees, and lithe, velvety shapes crept through the tall grass. After watching them for a while, the woman realized they were alive and awake like her. They were beautiful and wonderful, but they were not of her kind. Is there anyone else like me? She wondered. Now, reading that, I felt like I wasn't just watching Eve. I felt like I was Eve, because you can just see what she sees and feel what she feels so vividly. It's, again, the author really nailed the art of show, don't tell. And it doesn't even stop there, because I know so many people are familiar with the story of Eve. You know, Adam and Eve, because you can't have one without the other. So many people know Garden of Eden, talking snake, apple, kicked out of the garden, foreshadowing of a redeemer, all that good stuff. But the way the author tackles it is in a very wonderful way, because again, she doesn't even mention the original sin until a little later on in this section. She first talks about Eve's first experience of being alive and what she witnesses in the Garden of Eden. So she's not solely defined by her original sin like so many people tend to do. And yes, technically that is what she is most known for, and that is what makes her the most iconic, but she wasn't known solely for that. I guess it kind of doesn't help that the Bible doesn't really talk much about her, except for the fact that she was meant to be a companion to Adam, and that she chose to go her own way instead of God's way and ate the apple when she wasn't supposed to. But personally, the way that the author covers it is in a very, very gentle way. Like, see, being made in God's image means that he works through us to accomplish what he wants to do in the world. Even if, like Eve, we make terrible choices, God doesn't want our story to end there. He wants to save us from the brokenness of the world and the brokenness inside us. Through his power and through bearing his image, you can be strong. And again, way to tackle such a deep, difficult subject with children. Talking about, yes, we do live in a broken world, but there is someone greater out there who wants to help us, who won't let us down. Because I feel like we tend to get so caught up in this almighty and all-powerful and all-just God that we forget to talk about his compassionate side. And that's not even an isolated example. The book talks about his gentleness and mercy so many times. And I gotta say, I'm a little bit ashamed that I kind of glossed over that. I initially skipped that chapter when I first looked in this book because I thought, I already know everything about Eve. I don't need to read on this. But then I went back and read it and I was like, holy moly, this is amazing. But with that said, let me bring you to the part that caught my attention the most, the one that I did read first, and that's Hagar. So let's start. Hagar sank to her knees beside the spring. Her tears had long since dried on her face, but her hands still shook so much as she scooped water into them that she spilled as much as she drank. It was a long time before she was able to drink enough to stop her thirst. Hagar huddled in the shade of the wind-blown tree and wrapped her arms around her belly. The baby inside her kicked hard enough to make her gasp. She wondered if he could tell they were in a strange place, far from the familiar sounds of her master Abram's camp and the movements of Hagar's daily routine. Could the baby hear her groans and feel her chest heaving with sobs? Was he frightened too? Hagar rubbed the spot where her baby was kicking and tried to calm her breathing. And I gotta admit, that did mainly catch my attention because it openly admitted that Hagar was pregnant. And because if you've been a long-time follower of my channel, you know that that's something that I have long been interested in. But I feel like there's more to be said than that, and that's the fact that a lot of children's book authors tend to shy away from the topic of pregnancy unless it's specifically meant to be a teaching tool for kids about topics like reproduction and growth and stuff like that. And I think we as adults have sexualized the concept of pregnancy. And that's really, really an outdated mindset. Because if you've ever wondered the reason why so many of those old-timey shows never feature a woman who's actually pregnant, or why they never say the word pregnant and dress it up in euphemisms like expecting or with child, it's again because the word pregnancy was deemed too vulgar. They even kind of address that in the comedy series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And yes, we do know that pregnancy often results from that, but that doesn't mean that it's inherently sexual. Pregnancy is just a part of life. It's the beginning of life, and it's something that we shouldn't shy away from with kids. It's something that we shouldn't have to dress up in euphemisms, and it's certainly something we shouldn't have to lie to them about because they're going to find out one way or another. And again, also because it's not something that should be riddled in shame and shunned. And what I also love about it, and anyway, shying away from that, what I also love about this chapter was this part. Hagar regretted allowing herself to believe that Abram would favor her over his wife of so many years simply because Hagar was carrying his only child, the son he believed was part of a promise from his God. She regretted even more giving in to the temptation to treat her mistress Sarai like the secondary wife. Sarai's revenge had been quick and harsh. Hagar's body ached with bruises, and Sarai's angry words felt like they had been burned across her heart and mind. Sarai had made Hagar's life so miserable that she'd felt she had no choice but to run away. Now she was alone in the desert, pregnant and on the run. And now the reason I bring that up is because Hagar is, from what I can tell, mentioned in the Bible, yet so few people talk about her, except in the sense that, oh yeah, she was Abram's concubine. She was the one who gave him his first son, Ishmael, his illegitimate son, Ishmael. And that's, again, like Eve, she's only known for that one thing, being Abram's concubine, the mother of Ishmael, who ultimately became the prophet for a lot of people who practice Islam. But again, there's got to be so much more to her. It really goes into who she was. She was a poor girl who was taken from Egypt and far from her friends and her family, made to be a servant to Abram. She didn't choose this life. This life was thrust upon her, and people could easily use her boasting about being Abram's main wife as a justification for how she was treated. Now, I'm not saying this to condemn Sarah in any way. I'm saying this more as a condemnation of people who condemn Hagar and who see her as nothing but, being a Christian woman, I can't say what people would so often label her as, so I guess I could just use the term concubine, which she technically was, but she was more than that. She was a woman with her own mind, and again, I'm sure there was so much more to her, but the Bible really doesn't get much into that. We don't know. But again, I really admire Sarah Parker Rubio's attempt to give us some insight into her perspective. And sort of the thing is, the book also mentions that nobody cared about a servant's feelings. I never thought about Hagar as a servant. In fact, so often she was just the other woman in my mind, ever since I learned about her when I was a child. Because the Bible just kind of treats her like the other woman. And again, so many people can label her as evil or vain or cruel, but the book shows that God showed compassion on her by giving her many more descendants, that he was looking out for her, talking to her. And it also kind of makes you wonder, given that she was taken from Egypt, you can't help but wonder if maybe this is sort of a parallel to, if you can't help but wonder if what happened to the Israelites later was meant to serve as some sort of a parallel, and if that was sort of what what may have helped them, or at least was meant to be a way to open their eyes to show them, hey, don't treat people like property. Maybe the only way you'll learn is if this happens to you. Again, I'm not saying that's how it is for sure, but that's very much what it comes across. And then there's also the fact that it mentions, and not to mention, every part of the book has this section, her God, which ties in this historical message to what we can learn nowadays. For example, here it says, the Bible tells us that God is not impressed when we act like some people are more important than others. And I think that's a lesson for both Hagar and Sarah, as the book mentioned, that Hagar tried to act like she was more important, but at the same time, Sarah tried to treat Hagar like she was less important, when really we're all equal in the eyes of the Lord. Our value isn't based on our social status or the color of our skin, how much money we have, anything like that. It's based on who we are as individuals. And then there's the fact that it also says, however small and unimportant and unnoticed you may feel, you can know for sure that God sees you. He sees every tear you cry in the dark. He knows all the things you secretly wish for. He loves you deeply and wants to be close to you. The God who saw a frightened servant girl in the middle of the desert is the same God who sees you today. That's a message that so many little girls can relate to. So many women too, because so many girls and women often feel inferior when there are so many male role models and so many stories about what men can do and boys who can be strong and who have accomplished this and that girls kind of get tossed to the side. And honestly, I think this is something that's good for children in general, because so many kids can feel small and unimportant, especially compared to their older siblings or other kids in their class. And anyways, let me see if I can find another great part of the book. Leah. I mentioned that there are many parts of this book that are there are some parts of the book that are very personal to me. And one of this is Leah. Now you may be, and again, Leah's sort of another woman that kind of gets glossed over in the Bible. She's just known as the woman that Jacob was tricked into marrying the first time around, even though he wanted to marry her sister Rachel. But again, Leah, she was a very nurturing and loving mother to her own kids, and she constantly had to put up with being in her sister's shadow. So again, you can only imagine how the poor girl felt, especially when you read about her. Leah looked at her oldest son, remembering his birth. The name Reuben meant, look, a son. How she'd hoped that Jacob would love her for giving him his first son. She knew he would never love her as much as he loved Rachel, his other wife, and Leah's younger sister. Leah had never been able to compare with Rachel in anything, definitely not in looks. Everyone had always talked about Rachel's beauty ever since they were little. Men always noticed Rachel. Jacob had fallen in love with her practically the instant he had arrived in their town. Leah and Rachel's father, Laban, had only cared about how much money he could get for his daughters by marrying them off. He tricked Jacob into marrying Leah first, and then given him Rachel as his second wife. Jacob never made any secret of the fact that Rachel was his favorite. She tried to tell him she would have done anything for Jacob's love. She tried to tell him that through their sons' names. She named her second son Simeon, which meant one who hears, telling anyone who would listen, the Lord hears that I was unloved and has given me another son. Jacob hadn't gotten the hint, that time either. So when their third son was born, she called him Levi, being attached, thinking that surely Jacob would feel attachment or affection for her after she'd given him 3 sons. But he hadn't. I'm just going to say I put poor Leah with a sad face right there, because legitimately that was the moment my heart really broke for Leah. And you may be saying, how exactly does this hit close to her? How exactly does this hit close to home for you? Well, here's the thing. Have you ever felt less than or second best? Like you can't even compete, so you might as well not bother? Leah had probably felt that way her entire life. The Bible says Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. The phrase weak eyes is translated in several different ways in different versions of the Bible. Now, again, they mentioned that Leah constantly felt like she had to live in the shadow of her sister Rachel, and not gonna lie, while I haven't exactly been openly hostile or openly jealous like Leah was to Rachel or vice versa, there have been a lot of times where I envied my sister. I wished there were times where I thought, if only I was as skinny as my sister. If only I had my sister's pretty red hair instead of my ugly, dirty blonde hair. If only I had as many friends as my sister, then I would be happier. If only I had gotten as good of grades in my classes as my sister did, because she was able to take, because when she was in high school, she was able to take classes at a much higher level than I did. And I've also thought, if only I was able to manage my life on top of theater, because I remember trying the spring musical when I was in 7th grade, and I just thought it was way too stressful on top of my schoolwork. And then seeing my sister in all of these activities, speech, dance, plays, choir, and going to all of those and seeing my parents give her these flowers and presents and showering her with praise. I mean, it's kind of made me forget about what I'm good at and what they've praised me for, because in the moment, all I could think of was how they were all over my sister and how much attention she'd been getting. But of course, they also talk about Rachel's perspective in the very next chapter. And they kind of show us that Rachel didn't exactly have it either. They talked about how angry she was that her father stole her wedding day and gave it to Leah. And I honestly hadn't thought about that, because again, the Bible doesn't talk to us about how Rachel felt. The Bible doesn't even say how Rachel or Leah felt about being married to Jacob. And most likely, they didn't even have a say, because the book states in a previous chapter that women and girls typically didn't have a say in the marriage. Some of them did, but most of the time it was made by a father or another older male relative. So they were dealt this hand and they just had to do the very best with what they were given. And then there's the fact that Rachel watched her sister Leah have son after son after son while she couldn't get pregnant. So at one point, she gave Jacob a concubine, hoping that would help things. But then Leah gave him her concubine, her servant to use as a concubine. So they were constantly fighting each other. And then there's also it also mentions, sadly, just as Rachel and Leah's father didn't do a good job caring for them, they didn't do a very good job caring for each other. And there's sort of that message about how women are often pitted against each other for other people's own sick pleasure. Or in this case, they were pitted against each other because their father just wanted to use them to make money. And again, one can only imagine how Leah felt being set up with Jacob, because her father was basically saying, you're not nearly as pretty as your sister, and no guy is ever going to want you to be his wife. So you might as well settle for this guy, because I'm going to trick him into marrying you so that I can get money, and so I won't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to marry you off to any other guy, because nobody else will want you, because again, you're not as pretty as your sister. And again, Rachel had to deal with the fact that while she was pretty and while she had Jacob's love and affection, for the longest time, she didn't have the son that she so wanted. Meanwhile, Leah had so many sons and a daughter. And something else I kind of want to mention is one time I was doing a report on a Bible verse. Rachel is weeping over her children, for they are no more. And during my search, I can't remember where this is, but it talked about most likely how she died. And they say that it was most likely when she was giving birth to only her second son, Benjamin, and how he was most likely a breech baby, which means he was coming out feet first in this case, which is most likely how they knew he was a boy before he was even fully out, and that she died of a postpartum hemorrhage, because when the uterus has been contracting for so long, the muscles in the uterus can get worn out and stop contracting, which which means that the uterus can't prevent heavy bleeding, and thus women can bleed to death. And of course, nowadays we have the methods to stop this. Well, unfortunately, some women still do succumb to postpartum hemorrhage. Nowadays, we have more means to deal with that through things like blood transfusions and advanced medicines. Now, anyways, kind of getting on to the one thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and this is most likely just a nitpick, but it's this part. Instead of sticking together and being grateful for what they had, they each made themselves miserable. And on one hand, I kind of understand, because you want to teach people that, you know, even if life's dealt you a bad hand, then sometimes the best thing you can do is keep your head up high and find the good in life and all that stuff. But at the same time, I can't help but be like, are you really blaming Rachel for being unhappy with the situation, considering she didn't choose to be infertile and that she had to constantly deal with not only the pain of not having a baby she so wanted for so long, but also the fact that they flat out mentioned that infertility was so rooted in shame that people believed that if you couldn't have a baby, it meant that God didn't like you. So are you really blaming her for being miserable when she was dealt a bad hand? But like I said, that's most likely just a nitpick. So many of these parts can be interpreted in so many different ways. But for now, I think I'm going to stop there. So if you're looking for a book about strong, powerful women of the Bible, some familiar names, some who may not have been mentioned as much, I highly suggest you pick up this book, because it's simple, and because the wording is simple and to the point enough for young girls to get the message, yet it's straightforward enough and detailed enough for adults to get into. I mean, I'm 24 and I really love this book, so give it a chance and maybe you or your young daughter or niece or whatever will really enjoy this book. So, now that that's over, I say God bless you and happy Holy Week.